December 1944. A bitter wind swept across the American Midwest, rattling the barbed wire fences of a prisoner-of-war camp. Inside, hundreds of weary German soldiers shuffled into line for the midday meal. Their boots scuffed frozen ground. Their breath hung like smoke, and their faces bore the gaunt, tired look of men far from home. They expected what they had grown used to in captivity: boiled potatoes, stew, perhaps bread if the day was generous. But that day, something different happened. A sharp metallic pop rang out, foreign and unexpected. The sound echoed across the mess hall like a signal from another world. One prisoner craned his neck, then another, until the line shifted with curiosity. A guard, casually leaning against the counter, was prying the cap off a glass bottle. Dark liquid fizzed inside, releasing a sweet scent into the cold air. Then, with an almost theatrical gesture, the guard poured the drink into a prisoner's tin cup. The German stared, bewildered. This wasn't soup or water, or the thin coffee substitute he imagined. It was Coca-Cola. Later, he would write in his diary, "Our enemy gave us soda. We could hardly believe it. It was as if America had captured the sun, bottled it, and handed it to us." For men who had left behind families, scrounging turnips in bombed-out cities, who had fought in deserts and forests with only the barest rations, the idea of tasting a fizzy, sweet American drink inside a POW camp was nearly unimaginable. Some lifted the cups cautiously, as though suspecting a trick. The first sip burned and tickled their throats, a shock of bubbles racing across their tongues. A few coughed, sputtering at the unfamiliar sensation. Then laughter broke out, low at first, then growing. One prisoner raised his cup toward another, mimicking a toast. For a brief moment, the fences, the guards, the war itself seemed far away. The irony was impossible to miss. In Germany, propaganda had painted America as a land of greed and brutality, a decadent society softening under luxury. Yet here in captivity, the prisoners encountered that very abundance firsthand, not as mockery, but as refreshment. Coca-Cola, the symbol of modern America, had somehow made its way behind barbed wire. The guards treated it casually, almost dismissively, sipping from their own bottles while leaning against the walls. To them, Coke was ordinary, a daily indulgence, as common as coffee. But to the prisoners, it was a revelation. They whispered to each other in disbelief. How could the enemy afford to hand out such luxuries, even to captives? Some POWs felt a stab of guilt as the sweetness lingered on their tongues. Their families back home, huddled in freezing apartments under the thunder of Allied bombers, had nothing like this. Mothers rationed scraps, children dreamed of bread, and here they were, soldiers who had lost the war, sipping soda in an American camp. One prisoner remarked bitterly, "If only my children could drink this instead of water from broken pipes." Another, with a half smile, said softly, "Perhaps this is how America wins. Not with bullets, but with bottles." The guards themselves seemed amused at the reaction. To them, sharing Coca-Cola with prisoners wasn't a grand gesture of policy, but a simple extension of everyday American life. Coke was everywhere in wartime America. On factory assembly lines, in soldiers' mess kits, at USO dances, and now, even in POW camps. It was part of the national fabric, as vital to morale as uniforms and rations. But for the Germans, the experience was transformative. That first sip of Coke marked a fracture in their expectations, a sharp contrast to everything they had been told. America, they realized, wasn't starving. It wasn't weak. It wasn't broken by war. Instead, it had so much abundance that it could spare luxuries, even for prisoners. That realization struck deeper than any weapon. As the men filed back to their barracks, clutching cups, or recalling the fizz still dancing on their tongues, they talked in low voices about what it meant. Was this kindness, Was it arrogance? Or was it simply the way America lived? The question swirled with every memory of the bubbles, every echo of that metallic pop of the bottle cap. That night, as snow drifted silently outside the fences, some prisoners lay awake, staring at the barack rafters, replaying the moment again and again. A bottle of Coca-Cola, so small, so ordinary for their captors, had become, in their eyes, a symbol of something larger, not just of America's wealth, but of its strange willingness to treat enemies with humanity. The story of soda in a POW camp spread quickly, carried from man to man, from camp to camp. And though the war raged on across oceans, behind the wire, a simple drink had reshaped the way many German prisoners saw their captors. What they could not yet know was how they had even come to be here, how soldiers who had fought in deserts and cities now stood in the heart of America, tasting a drink they had only heard of before the war. To understand that, we must go back to the battlefields of Europe and North Africa, where the journey of these prisoners began. The journey to that Coca-Cola bottle did not begin in an American camp. It began in the dust and smoke of war. North Africa, 1943. The desert sun beat down on weary Italian and German soldiers of the Afrika Korps. Their tanks lay smoldering, fuel was gone, and supply lines had been cut off by relentless Allied advances. Under the command of Rommel, they had fought fiercely, maneuvering across endless dunes and rocky passes. But by spring, the fight was over. Thousands of Axis troops laid down their arms at places like Tunisia and Bizerta. Some were gaunt from hunger. Others carried wounds bound hastily with rags. They expected to die as prisoners, or at best, to be shoved into barbed wire pens somewhere along the North African coast. Yet when they were marched under guard to waiting ships, many felt a new kind of dread. The rumors whispered among them were darker than the desert nights. They were not bound for Britain or even Canada. They were being shipped across the Atlantic to America itself. For many, the very idea seemed impossible. How could they be transported so far? But the Allies controlled the seas, and America's logistical machine was unmatched. Crammed into the holds of troopships, German POWs endured seasickness, heat, and the stench of hundreds of men packed together. Guards patrolled with rifles, but there was little resistance. These men were beaten, their once proud army reduced to captives of an enemy they had been told was weak. The voyage lasted weeks. At night, prisoners lay awake to the rumble of engines and the creak of steel. Some thought about families back in Hamburg or Munich. Others imagined what awaited them on the far shore. Nazi propaganda had told them capture by the Americans would mean starvation, humiliation, or worse. Some expected labor camps, no different from the ones their own regime had built. Then came the morning when the fog lifted and they saw it, the skyline of New York City. For many German prisoners, this was their first glimpse of America. Rising towers, bridges arched like iron rainbows, and the sight of the Statue of Liberty looming over the harbor. A bitter irony filled them. They had marched for Hitler's empire, and now they were prisoners in the very land their leaders had mocked as decadent and soft. Some pressed against the rails, staring at the giant billboards visible from the docks. They saw cars, advertisements, and lights even in daytime, all signs of abundance that war-torn Europe could no longer imagine. But most would not stay in New York. Trains carried them inland, deeper into the heart of the United States. The destinations were places few had heard of before the war: Georgia, Texas, Iowa, Nebraska. Camps were built far from coasts and borders, often near farmland or factories where prisoners could work under supervision. The journey into the American countryside was another shock. They expected grim labor camps, perhaps barbed wire and armed guards at every corner. Instead, many camps were neat, almost orderly in their design. Wooden barracks stretched in rows, surrounded by fences. Watchtowers stood at the corners, yes, but inside were kitchens, mess halls, even recreation fields. In some places, American farmers stood along the rail lines, staring at the passing columns of enemy soldiers. Children pointed, some in curiosity, others in fear. For many small towns, this was the first time they had seen Germans in the flesh. The POWs themselves felt a strange dissonance. They were prisoners, stripped of freedom, but the land around them seemed calm, untouched by the destruction of war. In Germany, cities burned nightly under Allied bombs. Here, the towns they passed looked whole, with white-painted houses, busy shops, and fields heavy with crops. The camps varied in size. Some held a few hundred men, others thousands. But everywhere the reaction was the same. Surprise at the order, the efficiency, and the strange sense of normalcy. The Germans had braced themselves for cruelty, but instead they found discipline without brutality. Guards were firm but often casual, treating their captives with a mix of indifference and occasional courtesy. Still, the prisoners carried humiliation like a weight. Men who once marched in victory parades now lined up for roll call under the eyes of the enemy. They slept on cots, worked on farms, or repaired roads. Yet even in this new life, they noticed something else, something uniquely American. It was in the food, the habits of their captors, and even the way the guards spoke to each other. There was a sense of ease, of plenty, of confidence. The true depth of that difference would become clear not in the barracks or the fields, but in the small luxuries that seeped into daily camp life. Chocolate bars, baseball games, chewing gum, and most astonishing of all, the dark, fizzy drink called Coca-Cola. The story of how soda fountains and bottling plants appeared behind barbed wire is one of the strangest and most symbolic chapters of the war. And to understand it, we must first look closely at what daily life was like inside those camps. The first morning in camp was always the hardest. A whistle shrieked through the dawn air, and the prisoners stirred from their cots. Thin mattresses creaked, boots shuffled against wooden floors, and the smell of coffee drifted faintly from the kitchens. For many German POWs, the aroma alone was shocking. Coffee had been scarce in Europe for years, replaced by bitter substitutes made from roasted barley or acorns. Here, even the enemy's guards began their day with real coffee. Outside, a bugle sounded. The men lined up in the yard, rows of gray uniforms now replaced by mismatched work clothes issued by the Americans. Barbed wire glinted in the morning sun. Watchtowers loomed above, and armed sentries counted heads. Roll call was a ritual, precise, efficient, and unyielding. Yet unlike the brutal inspections they had feared, it was simply a routine, carried out with the same indifference soldiers use when punching a clock. Beyond the wire stretched America's farmland. In Kansas, fields of wheat rolled toward the horizon. In Texas, mesquite trees cast long shadows across the dust. In Iowa, barns painted red stood tall against wide skies. The scenery itself was disorienting. Many POWs expected bleak prisons. Instead, they were placed in the heart of America's breadbasket. The irony cut deep. While their families at home rationed scraps, they were surrounded by abundance. Inside the camps, the barracks were Spartan but orderly. Wooden walls lined with cots, stoves burning in winter, small lockers for personal belongings. Each camp had a mess hall, where meals were served on metal trays. The portions surprised the prisoners. Meat appeared regularly, often spam or beef stew. Bread was fresh, sometimes even white and soft, unlike the dense, sawdust-stretched loaves of wartime Germany. Vegetables, potatoes, beans. The variety alone was astonishing. And occasionally, dessert, a slice of pie, canned fruit, or a cookie. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment, and the Americans followed it carefully. But beyond the rules, there was also a cultural ease that prisoners noticed. Guards did not bark insults or strike them without cause. Discipline was enforced, but without cruelty. Many POWs described it as strange. They were enemies, but not hated. Work was part of daily life. Under supervision, POWs were sent to local farms to harvest crops, mend fences, or chop wood. Others labored in sawmills, repaired roads, or cleared brush. The labor was tiring, but it kept men occupied, and it came with payment in the form of camp scrip or small wages. Prisoners could use this to buy cigarettes, toiletries, or treats at the camp canteen. And it was in those canteens that they first encountered the small luxuries that defined American life. Rows of shelves with soap, shaving cream, candy bars, and sometimes the green and red logo of Coca-Cola. The hiss of carbonation, the clink of bottles, the sharp sweetness on the tongue. For many prisoners, it was their very first taste of the drink that had become a symbol of America itself. Recreation also filled their days. Soccer fields were marked out inside the wire, and games were played with fierce energy. Baseball was introduced too, though few Germans understood the rules at first. Music drifted from radios, and in some camps, prisoners formed orchestras with instruments provided by the YMCA. Books, newspapers, and even classes were offered. The camps became strange little villages, fenced off from the world, yet brimming with activity. To the Americans watching from nearby towns, the sight could be unsettling. A Kansas farmer once recalled seeing German soldiers march past his fields in neat columns, their blonde heads and youthful faces so similar to the sons he had sent to Europe. Local children gawked at the prisoners, expecting monsters, and instead saw ordinary young men, many barely out of their teens. Some townsfolk resented the prisoners' seemingly comfortable lives. Others grew curious, even sympathetic. For the prisoners themselves, emotions were mixed. Relief that they were safe, fed, and alive. Humiliation that they wore the label of defeat. Curiosity about the strange land around them. And always, the gnawing guilt of knowing their families at home endured bombings, shortages, and hunger. Life inside the wire was not paradise. There were rules, restrictions, and the constant reminder of captivity. Escape attempts happened, though most ended quickly, with men caught in fields or forests not far from camp. Yet compared to the brutal images they had feared, daily life was almost ordinary. Routine meals, work shifts, leisure time. And woven through it all were the small signs of American abundance. The smell of meat frying in kitchens, the laughter of guards tossing a baseball in the yard, the sight of soda bottles in canteen windows. To men raised on tales of American weakness, the reality was bewildering. It was Coca-Cola, more than anything else, that crystallized this contrast. A simple drink, yet a luxury so casually consumed by their captors, it symbolized an entirely different world. To understand how a soft drink became a weapon of culture, we must look beyond the wire to the history of Coca-Cola itself. Before German prisoners ever held a bottle in their hands, Coca-Cola had already become more than a drink in America. By the 1940s, it was a cultural symbol, a liquid trademark of modern life, prosperity, and the everyday pleasures soldiers were fighting to defend. The story began decades earlier. Born in Atlanta in the late 19th century, Coca-Cola was originally sold as a tonic, mixed at drugstore counters. By the 1920s and 30s, it had transformed into a national obsession. Its red and white logo glowed from billboards, its glass bottles clinked in diners and service stations. To millions of Americans, Coke wasn't just refreshment, it was America in a bottle. When war broke out, Coca-Cola followed the troops. In 1941, after Pearl Harbor, The company's leaders pledged that every American in uniform would be able to buy a Coke for just 5 cents, no matter where they were stationed. This wasn't just clever marketing, it was logistics on a massive scale. Coca-Cola bottling plants sprouted near bases and ports. Portable bottling lines were shipped overseas. Engineers and technicians, dubbed Coca-Cola men, wore uniforms and traveled alongside soldiers, setting up operations in North Africa, Europe, and the Pacific. For GIs, Coke became a taste of home. Soldiers wrote in letters about the comfort of cracking open a bottle in the desert heat or after a long march through mud. Some joked that the fizzy drink was better for morale than bullets. In the mess halls of ships and bases, ice-cold Coke was a small reminder of civilian life, of soda fountains back in Indiana, of dates at drive-ins in California, of family picnics under summer skies. The Germans, by contrast, had nothing like it. During the war, Coca-Cola's German branch had been cut off from syrup shipments. Forced to improvise, they created a substitute called Fanta, made from fruit scraps. But to German soldiers in the field, Coke remained largely unknown, a whispered symbol of decadent America. Propaganda dismissed it as frivolous, a sugary indulgence of a weak nation. And so the shock was all the greater when POWs encountered it in captivity, behind barbed wire, in the canteens of American camps. They discovered that the very enemy they had been taught to scorn casually drank what was, to them, an exotic luxury. Imagine the sensory contrast. A prisoner, weary from work detail, steps into a camp canteen. The air smells of tobacco and soap. Cigarettes hang in neat packs, candy bars stacked in rows. And there, in a wooden crate by the counter, gleam bottles of Coca-Cola. A guard pops the cap with a casual flick. A hiss, a fizz, and the sweet scent of caramel and vanilla rises from the neck. For men used to bitter ersatz coffee or watered-down broth, the taste was extraordinary. Coca-Cola wasn't just refreshment. It was spectacle. It carried with it an entire atmosphere of ease, abundance, and casual enjoyment. To see American guards sipping Coke while flipping through newspapers, or to hear the familiar pop of caps at a baseball game inside camp, was to witness a cultural ritual. The Germans realized that, for Americans, comfort and war were not opposites. Somehow, both coexisted. For the U.S. military, this was deliberate. Coke was treated as more than a drink. It was morale in a bottle, a symbol of home carried across the world. General Eisenhower himself requested shipments of Coca-Cola to North Africa, insisting that his troops needed that taste of America as much as ammunition. By 1945, the company had built more than 60 bottling plants overseas, producing millions of bottles a day. The irony was unmistakable. German soldiers who had been raised on strict discipline and scarcity now found themselves captives in a system that handed out luxuries not even their officers could have dreamed of. Coke, in its simple fizz, conveyed a truth. America could afford abundance, even in war. And that truth carried a powerful psychological weight. To the POWs, Coca-Cola was proof that the stories told by Nazi propaganda of a crumbling, starving America were lies. Here was evidence in liquid form. A nation that could send soft drinks across oceans and into prison camps was not weak. It was unstoppable. Some prisoners marveled at the taste, others at the casualness. One diary entry recorded the disbelief. They drink this sweet water as if it is nothing. At home, even sugar is a treasure. Another compared it to a toast of victory given by our captors. Of course, not every camp had Coke on hand, and not every prisoner tasted it. But the idea spread quickly, carried in letters and memories. Coca-Cola became shorthand for America's wealth, its culture, and its strange generosity. And soon, POWs would discover that it wasn't just delivered in bottles from outside. In some camps, it was made right there, bottled behind the same barbed wire that confined them. In the stillness of an American POW camp, the sound of machinery was unexpected. To German prisoners, the whir of gears or the hiss of steam usually meant factories producing weapons of war. But here, behind barbed wire, the noise carried a different meaning. It was the hum of bottling equipment, filling, capping, and packing bottles of Coca-Cola. For many prisoners, the first time they saw it felt surreal. Instead of guards marching with rifles or trucks unloading ammunition, they watched crates of soda stacked neatly, destined for both American soldiers and, sometimes, the prisoners themselves. To men who had marched through ruined towns in France or stood in breadlines back in Germany, this was an almost absurd luxury. Captivity, they realized, did not mean starvation. It meant proximity to American abundance, and nothing symbolized that more than Coke. Coca-Cola bottling was so entwined with the American military effort that even some camps gained access to nearby plants. In Texas, Oklahoma, and Georgia, trucks from regional bottling companies rolled straight to the gates, delivering cases not only for GIs, but also for the canteens where prisoners could buy treats with their camp scrip. In a few cases, mobile bottling units were set up near large bases, churning out thousands of bottles a day. Soldiers joked that wherever the army went, Coke went too. The prisoners quickly noticed that Coca-Cola wasn't just a drink, it was infrastructure. Wooden crates marked, with the iconic red script stacked in orderly rows, chilled bottles clinking in ice-filled coolers, the pop and fizz echoing across the mess hall. To German eyes, it seemed incredible that the same energy their nation poured into tanks and artillery, America directed into soda distribution. The casual coexistence of war and consumer comfort baffled them. Some camps even allowed POWs to work in or around these supply systems. Prisoners on labor detail recalled unloading crates of Coke, handling bottles with curiosity, sometimes sneaking glances at their reflections in the dark glass. For men who had been fed propaganda about starving Americans, this was a revelation. Not only were the Americans not starving, they were drowning in abundance, enough to share with their enemies. The shock ran deeper than taste. To many Germans, Coca-Cola represented something larger, the rhythm of American life. Guards would crack open bottles after roll call, sip while listening to baseball scores on the radio, or hand them out during camp gatherings. It was woven into daily routine, the same way bread and black coffee had been in Germany. The prisoners began to associate the fizz of a Coke with the sound of laughter, the sight of leisure, and the unmistakable truth that America fought its wars with both guns and consumer goods. Letters home carried the stories. "We drank Coca-Cola today," one prisoner wrote, "the sweet brown water the Americans love." Families back in Germany often dismissed these lines as exaggeration or propaganda tricks. How could their sons be sipping soda in captivity while they themselves bartered for potatoes on the black market? Yet for the men in the camps, the bottles were real, the taste undeniable. This astonishment often came with a sting of guilt. POWs thought of their families in bombed-out cities, children lining up with ration cards, wives stretching loaves of bread with ersatz ingredients. The contrast was almost unbearable. A sip of Coke could transport them for a moment, not just into the world of America, but into the reminder of what their own homeland had lost. Still, the presence of Coca-Cola bottling inside or near the camps wasn't only about irony. It carried a subtle message. The Americans treated their prisoners according to the Geneva Conventions, but they also went further. They extended a piece of their culture. By offering Coke, they showed that, even in war, they could afford generosity. It was soft power delivered in a glass bottle, a demonstration that abundance itself could be a weapon. one that attacked not the body but the mind. For the Germans, this message sank in. The clang of bottles, the fizz of soda, and the sight of American guards sipping casually beside them became unforgettable. Coke was not just refreshment. It was proof that the enemy lived in a different world, one of factories and consumer comforts, where even barbed wire fences could not contain abundance. And yet, the most telling reactions came not from what they saw, but from what they felt as they tasted. Now it was time to step into their perspective, the astonishment, the delight, and the guilt of drinking Coca-Cola for the very first time. For most German prisoners, the first sip of Coca-Cola was not simply about flavor. It was a revelation. They had heard of the drink, perhaps seen advertisements, before the war, but few had ever tasted it. In Germany, Coca-Cola had been available before the conflict, but after the U.S. entered the war, shipments of syrup ceased. What remained in Europe was scarce, and most German soldiers had grown up without ever seeing a bottle. So when it appeared in American camps, the reaction was one of wide-eyed disbelief. A letter home from a young POW captured the shock. They give us a sweet brown water with bubbles. It tastes strange, like candy, and they call it Coca-Cola. Can you imagine? We, prisoners, drink as they do. To his family, enduring bombings and ration cards, the description must have seemed like fantasy, or perhaps a cruel joke. But within the camps, it was real. Bottles hissing open, soda foaming over tin cups, laughter echoing as men compared impressions of the flavor. At first, some were skeptical. The liquid looked unusual, darker than beer, fizzing unnaturally. A few refused, suspecting a trick. But curiosity won out. One sip, and most were hooked, though not without irony. They described it in their diaries as American champagne or a drink for children, sometimes mocking its sweetness, yet returning for more. The reactions varied. Some prisoners laughed in delight, smacking their lips at the sweetness. Others grew quiet, the taste stirring uncomfortable thoughts. They knew their wives and children in Germany were standing in breadlines, drinking ersatz coffee made from roasted barley. The guilt weighed heavily. How could they, captured and confined, enjoy luxuries while their families starved? The contrast stung even as the fizz tickled their throats. Still, the Coca-Cola moments often lifted spirits. A group of POWs might gather in the canteen, trading cigarettes for scrip to buy a bottle, then pass it around, each taking a careful sip. They compared notes. "It tastes like caramel," one said. "No, like medicine," another argued. For many, it became a shared ritual, a reminder that even in captivity, there could be small pleasures. The astonishment wasn't only about taste, it was about meaning. To German eyes, Coke symbolized America's strange kind of power, not just military strength, but industrial abundance. Here was a nation that could fight a global war and still dedicate resources to bottling soda. To men trained on propaganda about starving, decadent Americans, the realization was jarring. The enemy, it seemed, lived in a world of luxuries, even while waging total war. Some POWs admitted envy. They envied the guards who could casually drink Coke every day, who grew up with it as an ordinary part of life. They envied the American soldiers who treated soda as a simple refreshment, while for prisoners it felt like a rare prize. And yet, there was also gratitude. For a moment, Coke broke the wall between captor and captive. Guards sometimes handed bottles to prisoners, sharing a drink in the heat of summer. A few POWs later recalled these moments with warmth, saying it was the first time they saw Americans not as enemies, but as fellow men. But for others, the sweetness turned bitter. One prisoner wrote, "We drank as if at a festival, yet our people at home have only hunger. I could not swallow without shame." The guilt gnawed at them. proof that captivity sometimes offered more comfort than freedom in a ruined homeland. The drink that symbolized America also symbolized contrast: sweetness against bitterness, abundance against scarcity, freedom against captivity. The prisoners could not escape the irony, and it left a deep impression. And as the bottles emptied, another truth emerged. Coca-Cola was not only changing their diet, it was challenging their beliefs. The next step in the story shows how this bubbly drink collided with the hard lines of Nazi propaganda. Long before German soldiers ever set foot in an American POW camp, they had been warned about what capture would mean. Nazi propaganda broadcasts repeated the same message: Americans were brutal, undisciplined, and decadent. Prisoners would be starved, beaten, and humiliated. Captivity, they were told, was a fate worse than death. For months, these warnings echoed in the minds of German troops. Surrender seemed unthinkable. Better to fight to the last bullet, they believed, than fall into the hands of such a cruel enemy. And yet, the reality inside American camps was profoundly different. Instead of starvation, there was food, not always plentiful, but fair and steady. Instead of beatings, there was routine: roll calls, work details, occasional discipline, but little cruelty. Instead of isolation, there was a strange exposure to American life: radios, newspapers, movies, and most shocking of all, luxuries like chocolate and Coca-Cola. For many prisoners, this shattered the narrative they had carried with them into war. The very things the regime had mocked, American abundance, consumer culture, and decadence, turned out to be real, but not in the way they had been told. They were not signs of weakness. They were signs of strength. A POW recalled in a letter, "We were told America was poor and starving. But here, even in war, they drink soda and eat meat every day. How can this be?" That question haunted many. If the enemy was truly decadent and collapsing, how could they afford such luxuries not only for their soldiers, but even for their prisoners? The irony was unmistakable. What German leaders had painted as America's flaw now looked like its greatest weapon. Abundance was not weakness, it was dominance. The Coca-Cola bottle, with its fizz and sweetness, became a quiet rebuke to the ideology that had sent them marching into battle. Still, not every prisoner embraced the revelation. Some clung stubbornly to their beliefs, dismissing what they saw as temporary or staged. They insisted the Americans were trying to trick them, that the soda and chocolate were bribes meant to soften them. Others, however, couldn't ignore what was in front of them. Each sip of Coke, each bite of candy, chipped away at the wall of propaganda. And perhaps the most dangerous part, from the German perspective, was that these small luxuries created moments of ease, even contentment. They gave prisoners time to think, to compare, to wonder if perhaps they had been lied to all along. This clash between expectation and reality left a lasting mark. For some, it was the beginning of doubt in the ideology they had once served. For others, it was simply confusion, a nagging sense that the world was not as simple as they had been told. And in the middle of it all stood the Coca-Cola bottle, a simple, fizzy reminder that sometimes propaganda collapses not under argument, but under lived experience. It was in those quiet moments, sipping soda in a canteen or watching guards laugh over shared bottles, that many POWs began to feel the war in a different way. Their enemy was not only powerful with guns and planes, but with culture, comfort, and abundance. And soon, this strange abundance led to something even more unexpected: moments of shared humanity between prisoners and guards, with Coca-Cola often at the center. On the surface, a prisoner of war camp was defined by fences, watchtowers, and strict rules. Yet within those boundaries, moments occurred that blurred the line between enemy and captor. And often, surprisingly, those moments were marked by the clink of Coca-Cola bottles. One summer afternoon in Texas, POWs on work detail finished stacking hay bales under the sweltering sun. As the guard called for a break, he pulled a wooden crate from the back of a truck. Bottles of Coca-Cola glistened with condensation. Without ceremony, he handed them out, one to each man, German and American alike. For a few minutes, the war faded. The men leaned on fence posts, tipping back their bottles, the sound of soda fizzing mixing with the cicadas in the fields. These were not official exchanges. No command ordered guards to share drinks. But across camps in the Midwest, the South, and the Plains, guards and prisoners found themselves in daily proximity. They worked side by side on farms, built roads together, or played baseball on makeshift diamonds. And in those moments of pause, sharing a bottle seemed natural. For the Germans, it was astonishing. They had been taught to see Americans as enemies bent on cruelty, yet here were guards treating them like weary men on a hot day. The irony was not lost. Some later wrote that their first genuine conversation with an American began with a shared Coke, a simple gesture that lowered the invisible wall of suspicion. At baseball games organized inside camps, Coca-Cola was everywhere. Guards cheered with bottles in hand, and POWs, sitting along the sidelines, sometimes received one too. Watching the game, while sipping the same drink, they felt for an instant as though they were part of a larger community, not outsiders defined by barbed wire. Even small-town civilians, visiting camps or interacting with POWs during farm work, occasionally extended the same courtesy. A farmer's wife might pass a Coke to a thirsty prisoner after a long morning in the fields. Local church groups brought crates for holiday gatherings. These gestures, though minor to Americans, were deeply moving for men who had expected nothing but hostility. Emotion filled these encounters. Some POWs described a strange warmth, a reminder that the world outside Nazi propaganda was far more complicated. Others confessed a pang of guilt, enjoying soda with their captors while their families endured hunger under bombing raids back home. Still, the moments mattered. They proved that even in wartime, humanity could flicker in the unlikeliest places. And Coca-Cola, of all things, became a bridge, not just a drink, but a token of peace in a world consumed by war. These bottles, opened with casual ease in fields and campyards, carried lessons that would follow the prisoners long after the fences were gone. But before they returned home, many would write about these experiences, letters that stunned their families and spread stories of America's abundance far beyond the camp gates. For German POWs in America, one of the few lifelines to home was the Red Cross mail service. Letters were censored, their words scanned for secrets, but still, they carried fragments of camp life across the Atlantic. And often, those letters contained stories that seemed unbelievable to families huddled in bombed-out basements. One prisoner wrote, "Today, after work, we drank a bottle of something they call Coca-Cola. Sweet, brown, full of bubbles. The Americans drink it every day, and sometimes we do too." Another told his wife, "Do not worry about me. I have food, clothes, even things I never dreamed of. We drink soda, eat chocolate. I think of you with sorrow, knowing you have so little." To families in Germany, these words were almost impossible to believe. Theirs was a world of ration cards and air raids, of empty shelves and long queues for scraps. Sugar was scarce, coffee a distant memory, and even bread was stretched with fillers. The idea that their captured sons were drinking fizzy sweet water in enemy camps felt absurd, or even insulting. Some suspected their letters had been tampered with, rewritten as propaganda. Others felt anger, resenting that their men lived in relative comfort, while children starved at home. When the war finally ended, the shock grew sharper. In 1946, thousands of German POWs were sent back across the Atlantic. Their ships docked in Bremerhaven or Hamburg, where men stepped onto home soil with a strange burden, the memory of abundance behind barbed wire. They returned not to familiar towns, but to ruins. Cities like Cologne, Dresden, and Berlin lay in rubble, their streets silent except for the crunch of debris underfoot. Families huddled in half-collapsed houses. Fires had long burned out, leaving only charred shells of neighborhoods. The contrast was devastating. Prisoners who had swum in camp pools or sipped Coca-Cola now queued for watery soup alongside their families. The taste of homecoming was not sweetness, but bitterness. Turnips, ration bread, sometimes nothing at all. Many admitted to a gnawing guilt. How could they describe the bottles of Coke, the baseball games, the laughter in captivity, when their loved ones had endured years of terror and hunger? Some chose silence. They tucked those memories away, fearing resentment. Others told the truth cautiously, describing how well they had been treated, how strange it felt to drink soda while their families dodged bombs. Their honesty often met disbelief. "It cannot be true," one mother reportedly told her son. "You are ashamed and make stories." And yet, the truth was undeniable. The returning men carried stories of a world where their enemies had lived in ease, where even prisoners tasted luxuries that ordinary Germans never knew. For some, these stories fueled bitterness, a sense of humiliation. For others, they sparked curiosity, a grudging admiration for the society that could wage war and still afford to hand out Coca-Cola. In time, those memories became part of post-war reflection. When American soldiers later occupied Germany and Coca-Cola bottling plants reopened, many former POWs recognized the familiar red and white logo. It was as if a piece of their captivity had followed them home, not as punishment, but as a symbol of the strange abundance they had once glimpsed through barbed wire. The letters and the memories carried weight for decades. They marked the divide between propaganda and reality, between hunger and abundance, between despair and a sweetness that prisoners never forgot. And as the years passed, veterans began to share these stories more openly, not only of war and captivity, but of the shock of a bottle fizzing open in an American camp, a sound that stayed with them longer than gunfire. Those memories would form the legacy of Coca-Cola, behind the wire, shaping how an entire generation of former enemies remembered America. Decades after the war, when the guns had fallen silent and the POW camps were long dismantled, many German veterans spoke not of battles or bullets, but of bottles. Not rifles, but refreshments. And most often, the bottle they remembered was Coca-Cola. For some, it was the first taste of America. Veterans, now old men, told their grandchildren stories that seemed almost comical, that in the middle of the world's bloodiest war, they drank soda pop in captivity. One former POW recalled with a laugh, "It was the strangest thing. We expected punishment, maybe hunger. Instead, we learned the taste of Coca-Cola." His family, raised in post-war Germany, where Coke had become commonplace, found it hard to imagine how shocking that taste once felt. The legacy of those moments stretched far beyond nostalgia. For German POWs, Coca-Cola became a symbol of the contradictions of their wartime experience. They had gone from fighting in ruined villages to sipping soda behind barbed wire. They had written letters home, describing luxuries their families could scarcely believe, and they had carried home memories of an enemy that seemed both alien and strangely humane. After the war, Coca-Cola expanded aggressively into Europe. Bottling plants opened in West Germany, and advertisements spread across newspapers and billboards. For many who had been prisoners, the sight of Coke in stores stirred powerful memories of camp canteens, of guards clinking bottles, of the shock of abundance in a time of scarcity. Some embraced it with warmth, seeing it as a bridge to a new world. Others felt pangs of guilt, remembering how they had enjoyed luxuries while their families starved. But either way, the impression was permanent. Coke had become entwined with their memory of captivity and, by extension, with their impression of America. It was not rifles or tanks that defined that memory, but sweetness, bubbles, and the casual generosity of a soft drink. Historians have since argued that Coca-Cola was more than refreshment during the war. It was a tool of soft power, a cultural ambassador bottled in glass. Soldiers carried it into foxholes and faraway islands, and even prisoners came to associate it with the strange kindness of their captors. It was proof of America's industrial might, a nation so powerful it could export comfort alongside combat. For the Germans who tasted it in camps, the legacy was deeply personal. They remembered the hiss of a cap being pried off, the fizz rising, the caramel sweetness that seemed impossibly luxurious. They remembered, too, the irony that in captivity they had known a taste of a better life than their families did in freedom. In reunions and memoirs, veterans sometimes confessed that the shock of Coca-Cola lingered more vividly than the roar of artillery. One wrote simply, "The war was misery, but I will never forget the day I first drank Coca-Cola." And so, the bottle became more than a drink. It became a metaphor for abundance in the face of scarcity, for humanity in the midst of brutality, for the strangeness of war where enemies could share a taste of sweetness. The closing image is easy to picture. A hot afternoon in 1944, somewhere in Texas or Iowa. German POWs sit in the shade of a barracks, barbed wire casting shadows on the dirt. An American guard cracks open a crate, the sharp hiss of bottles breaking the silence. He passes them out, one by one. The prisoners lift them to their lips, tasting America for the first time. The war will rage on, families will suffer, and battles will claim countless lives. But in that moment, there is only the fizz of a bottle, the sparkle of sunlight through brown glass, and the bewildered laughter of men who never expected kindness. Sometimes, history is carried not in guns or speeches, but in the small details, the crinkle of a chocolate wrapper, the strum of a guitar, or the hiss of a Coca-Cola bottle. For these German POWs, the legacy of captivity was forever linked to the taste of a soft drink. And in that legacy lies a truth. The strongest weapons are not always made of steel. Sometimes they are made of sweetness, bubbles, and the quiet shock of humanity in the unlikeliest places.